Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to get into the fascinating details of complex topics.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling something huge, a question philosophers, theologians have wrestled with for centuries: God and time.
Yeah, it's a big one. Does God experience time like us, moment by moment? Or is God somehow outside of it all?
Exactly. And the sources you send us, wow, they cover a lot of ground, different perspectives.
They really do. So our mission today is to unpack the main arguments, based on this material, for whether God is timeless outside time or temporal, meaning in time.
And there are some middle ground views too, right?
Absolutely. We'll touch on those as well. It really gets to the core of how we think about God's nature and, well, the nature of the universe itself.
Okay, let's dive in. Divine timelessness, the idea that God is temporal. What's the basic concept?
Well, it's the traditional view, really. God exists completely outside of time, doesn't experience the tick-tock, the succession of moments that defines our lives.
No past, present, future for God in the way we understand it.
Exactly. It's a stark contrast to the idea that God is temporal, but, eternal, existing in every moment, always has, always will.
Okay. Now, to really get a handle on timelessness, you mentioned Stump and Kretzmann are key figures here. They drew on Boethius.
Yeah, Boethius' definition of eternity is incredibly influential. He called it the whole, simultaneous, and perfect possession of boundless life.
Wow. Whole, simultaneous, and perfect possession of boundless life. That's a lot to unpack. What did Stump and Kretzmann see as the essential ingredients?
They boiled it down to four things. First, obviously, a timeless being has life.
Okay.
Second, that life is unlimited, boundless. Third, there's a kind of duration, but it's not temporal duration, not moment to moment.
Like a span, but not measured in seconds or years.
Sort of. And fourth, and this is maybe the most crucial part, a timeless being possesses its entire life all at once, simultaneously.
Right, which is so different from us. We only ever have this tiny slice, the present moment. The past is gone, the future isn't here yet.
Precisely. Our experience is sequential. But if God isn't experiencing this flow, this sequence, well, how does God relate to us? And all this stuff happening in time. That's the puzzle.
Yeah, that's where my brain starts doing gymnastics. How do you bridge that gap?
Well, Stump and Kretzmann proposed this concept they called ET simultaneity.
Eternal temporal simultaneity.
ET simultaneity. Okay, what's the idea?
The basic thought is that God, in his eternal present and a specific event happening in our time, can be sort of present to each other. They exist simultaneously, but each within their own frame of reference.
So it's not like God is experiencing, say, dinosaurs roaming the earth and me drinking my coffee right now in the same instant on some universal clock.
Exactly, not like that. Normal simultaneity is transitive. If A is simultaneous with B and B with C, then A is simultaneous with C.
Right.
But ET simultaneity isn't like that. God's timeless awareness of the pyramids being built and, you listening right now doesn't make those two temporal events simultaneous with each other. It's a unique relationship. Okay, so it avoids making all moments in history happen at the same time for God in a way that collapses our timeline.
Correct. But the challenge and the criticism was about whether this frame of reference language really works. Is it just a metaphor borrowed from physics, maybe inappropriately?
Right. Did people push back on this idea?
Oh, yeah. Some found the reference frame talk a bit, obscure. Like, what does that actually mean metaphysically? And thinkers like David Lewis, question more fundamentally if a being outside time could really observe or be present to temporal events in any way we can grasp.
It feels like a category mismatch almost. How can something timeless observe something unfolding in time?
That's the core of the objection. And then there was this other tricky aspect, a temporal duration. The idea that God's timeless life still has some kind of span, even if not measured temporally. Fitzgerald had issues with that.
What was Fitzgerald's point?
Fitzgerald argued, look, if you're going to talk about duration, it needs some structure, right? Some way to differentiate parts or aspects, even if they aren't sequential. Otherwise, what makes a temporal duration different from just no duration at all? Is it just a point?
So if it has duration, it seems like it must have some kind of parts or phases, even non-temporal ones. And if it doesn't, is duration the right word?
Exactly the dilemma. How did Stump and Kretzmann respond?
Yeah, what was their answer?
Well, initially, they really leaned on divine simplicity, the idea that God is fundamentally one, indivisible, without parts. They felt Fitzgerald's line of questioning might force them to give that up.
Okay.
Later, they tweaked their ET simultaneity concept, calling it ET prime or ET, trying to address these concerns more directly.
But did that satisfy everyone? I think Paget still had objections.
He did.
Yeah.
Alan Paget argued that even the revised ETs still relied too heavily on an analogy with Einstein's relativity that doesn't quite map.
How so?
In physics, simultaneity is relative, limited by light speed. Causality works within light cones. Applying that framework to a timeless God interacting with all temporal moments seemed like stretching the analogy too far. The underlying rules are just too different.
Right. Analogies from our physical world can only take you so far when talking about something supposedly outside it entirely.
Yeah.
Now, Brian Leftow came at this differently, with quasi-temporal eternality, or QTE.
Yes, Leftow tried a different approach. He agreed there might be distinct moments or aspects within God's eternal life, but argued they aren't ordered in time.
Okay, so not sequential like our moments.
Right. Instead, they have relationships like earlier and later, but in a purely non-temporal logical sense. And crucially, God experiences all these moments simultaneously in a timeless now.
So imagine God's life laid out, not on a line of time, but maybe spatially, like points on a map experienced all at once, but with inherent relationships between them.
That's a decent way to think about it. He thought QTE could handle Fitzgerald's duration challenge by allowing for these distinct non-temporal moments within God's life, giving it structure without making it sequential in time. And he thought it preserved divine simplicity.
He used the analogy of points on a line, I remember.
He did, suggesting these moments are more like distinct locations or aspects within God's unified life, not separate parts.
Leftow also made that distinction. TTPs, typically temporal properties.
Exactly, TTPs. His point was, some properties usually belong to temporal beings, like having a present or a life with duration. But, he argued, God could have these TTPs without actually being temporal.
So God could have a present, but it's a timeless, non-temporal present. And duration, but timeless duration.
That was the argument. Having a present doesn't automatically put you in time. It depends on the kind of present it is. It's a way to let God have analogs to temporal features without being bound by temporality itself.
Okay, getting pretty subtle here. But then Catherine Rogers came along and questioned this whole idea of timeless duration, didn't she?
She did. Rogers went back to the classic texts, Boethius, Augustine, and argued, well, maybe they didn't think of timelessness as involving duration at all.
Really? What did she think they meant?
She suggested their writings are ambiguous, and maybe they emphasize just the timeless present, a single, unchanging, eternal now, without any kind of stretch or duration. She argued timeless duration might be a later philosophical construct.
So for Rogers, timelessness is more like an eternal point than an eternal line.
Kind of, yes. A point of perfect awareness encompassing everything without needing extension itself. She also pointed out that defenders of timeless duration like Stump, Kretzmann, and Leftow didn't always seem to rely heavily on their own definitions of duration when actually responding to objections.
And she didn't like Stump and Kretzmann's parallel lines analogy either.
No, she found it problematic. How do the points on the eternal line map to moments in time? If it's not made of points, what does its duration mean? She preferred the older medieval image, a circle with a center.
Where time is the circle's circumference.
And timeless eternity is the center point, equidistant and equally related to all points on the circumference, but having no extension itself.
That's a powerful image. Did she critique Leftow's QTE as well?
Yes. She posed a dilemma for Leftow. You either have to clearly distinguish the moments in God's life from God's experience of them, or you have to say these distinct earlier and later moments are somehow simultaneous, which seems contradictory. Neither option seemed satisfactory to her.
So if Rogers ditches timeless duration, how does she explain God knowing the sequence of events in time?
She goes back to Augustine's analogy of memory. Just like we can hold a whole sequence of remembered events in our mind now, non-sequentially.
Like recalling a whole song at once, not note by note.
Exactly. Rogers suggests God, in his timeless present, knows the entire sweep of history non-sequentially. It's all simultaneously present to his awareness.
So timelessness for Rogers doesn't mean God is static or frozen.
Definitely not. She'd say frozen is a temporal concept. It just means God's existence isn't stretched out in time. It doesn't limit his knowledge or activity.
Okay, wow. That's a whirlwind tour of different takes on what timelessness even means. Now let's shift gears. Why do philosophers argue for it? What are the main reasons given for thinking God must be timeless?
Okay, yeah. There are a few major lines of argument. One of the biggest revolves around God's knowledge of future free actions.
The classic free will versus omniscience problem. How does timelessness supposedly help here?
Well, the standard problem arises if God is in time. If God, say, yesterday, knew infallibly that I will choose tea over coffee this morning.
Then it seems like you weren't really free to choose coffee because that would mean changing God's past belief, which seems impossible.
Exactly. It looks like God's past knowledge locks down your future choice. But if God is timeless, he doesn't have beliefs in the past. His knowledge isn't located at a prior point on the timeline.
So my choosing tea doesn't require me to have the power to change God's past, because God doesn't have a past in that sense.
That's the idea. God timelessly knows my choice, but that knowledge isn't situated before my choice in a way that causally necessitates it or requires changing the past if I choose differently.
But hold on, even if God's knowledge isn't in the past, if God timelessly knows I'll choose tea, doesn't that fact still mean I can't choose coffee? The knowledge exists even if timelessly.
That's a fair point, and the debate gets complex here. The timelessness advocate might say God's knowledge is determined by the event, not the other way around.
Like my free choice makes God's timeless knowledge what it is.
Sort of. If I freely choose tea, God timelessly knows that. If I were to freely choose coffee, God would timelessly know that instead. The knowledge conforms to the free event. The problem of changing the past belief is avoided.
Okay, it avoids that specific temporal paradox. But what about prophecies? If God tells a prophet today that I will choose tea tomorrow, now we have a statement in time.
Ah, yes, the prophet problem. You're right. Even if God's knowledge is timeless, if he reveals it into time via a prophet, that prophet's belief is in the past relative to my choice. It seems to recreate the conflict with free will.
So timelessness doesn't just make the whole problem vanish.
Not necessarily. Some philosophers, like Whiter or Warenga, even talk about the possible prophet problem. Just the possibility that God could reveal the future might conflict with robust free will, even if he never actually does. It's tricky.
Definitely tricky. Okay, so foreknowledge is one major argument for timelessness. What's another?
Another key one comes from the idea of the fullness of God's being, profession, basically.
Fullness of being. How does timelessness relate to that?
The thought is that God possesses all his perfections, life, knowledge, power to the absolute maximum degree. And some argue that a temporal life lived sequentially is inherently less full.
Less full. How so?
Because in any given moment of a temporal life, the past is gone, vanished, and the future hasn't happened yet. Your present experience is just a sliver. There can be a sense of loss, of incompleteness, maybe regret for the past, or anticipation for the future.
Things we definitely feel as humans. Wistfulness, maybe?
Exactly. Those feelings seem linked to the transient nature of time. A timeless God, however, experiencing his entire infinite life simultaneously, that Boethian whole, simultaneous, and perfect possession, wouldn't have that sense of loss or incompletion. His being is fully actualized all at once.
But couldn't someone argue back that our negative feelings about time, regret, anxiety come from our finitude, our limited lifespan and memory, not from temporality itself?
Absolutely. That's a strong counter.
An eternal temporal God with infinite life and perfect memory wouldn't necessarily feel loss or regret in the same way we do, right? They'd perfectly remember the past to know the future, if foreknowledge is possible.
That's precisely the counter-argument from proponents of divine temporality. They'd say temporality itself isn't the imperfection, finitude is. However, the timelessness advocate doubles down. No, the very mode of sequential existence is inherently less complete, less perfect than possessing everything at once. For them, timelessness is the ultimate fullness, not an impoverishment.
Okay, I see the clash of intuitions there. Fullness as all at once versus fullness as infinitely unfolding. Got it. What's the third main argument you mentioned? Something about creation.
Right. God and the creation of the universe. This one starts with the idea that time itself might be contingent.
Meaning time isn't fundamental, it depends on something else for its existence.
Exactly. It depends on God. If time is something God created, then it's possible for God to exist without time.
Okay, makes sense.
Then you connect this to the creation of the universe. The dominant scientific view is that the physical universe had a beginning, the Big Bang.
Right.
The question then is, did time itself begin with the universe? If God created the physical universe and the framework of time along with it,
then God must have existed before time began, which means God must be timeless, at least in that pre-creation state.
that's the core of the argument. If time is part of the created order, the creator must transcend it. And unless God somehow became temporal upon creating time, he would remain fundamentally timeless. Some arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument, try to show philosophically that the past must be finite, reinforcing the idea that time had a beginning.
So creation itself points towards a timeless creator. Interesting. Okay, we've looked at timelessness, what it might mean, why people argue for it. Let's flip the coin. Divine temporality.
Right. The view that God is in time.
What's the core idea here? And proponents still see God as maximally great, right?
Absolutely. They don't see temporality as a limitation. They affirm God's omniscience, omnipotence, eternity, meaning existing at all times without beginning or end. Often this view is motivated by wanting to stay close to how God is described in Scripture, interacting, responding, acting within history. Psalm 90.2, before the mountains were born, from everlasting to everlasting you are God, is often cited.
So it feels more aligned with a God who is actively involved in the world's timeline.
For many, yes. And that leads directly into one of the main arguments for temporality: divine action.
How does God acting support God being temporal?
Well, God acts, right? Creates, sustains the universe moment by moment, sometimes intervenes. If God's sustaining action is different at time t1 than it is at t2 because the state of the universe is different, then doesn't that imply God changes? And change implies temporality.
Especially his interactions with people, redemption, answering prayer, forgiveness, comfort. These seem inherently sequential.
Exactly. Take answering prayer. You ask, then God answers. That looks like a temporal sequence. Request first, answer second. How could a timeless God genuinely respond?
Although the timelessness folks have an answer for that, don't they?
They do. They'd say God timelessly wills the answer in the same eternal act where he timelessly knows the request will be made.
Like the father packing the sandwich before the kid even asks, knowing the request is coming.
Something like that. The effects of God's single, timeless act of will unfold sequentially in time, but God's act itself isn't sequential.
So the temporalists would say that feels a bit contrived. It doesn't capture the dynamic interaction.
Pretty much. They'd argue that God's genuine, moment-by-moment engagement with the world strongly suggests God shares our temporal framework.
Okay, so divine action is one pillar. What's another major argument for God being temporal?
Divine knowledge of the present. The what time is it now problem we touched on.
Right. The idea that an all-knowing God must know what day it is today.
Precisely. And today changes every day. If God knows today's Tuesday, then tomorrow his knowledge must change to today is Wednesday or yesterday was Tuesday.
And if God's knowledge changes, then God changes. And changing implies being in time. A timeless being is usually thought to be unchanging, immutable.
That's the argument in a nutshell. Knowing the constantly shifting now seems to require being in the now, experiencing its shift.
Again, the timelessness defenders have responses here too.
They do. One main response is to say God doesn't know things nat times. He knows things out times, timelessly.
So God doesn't think it is now Tuesday.
Instead, he timelessly knows the proposition the day humans called Tuesday, April 21st occurs. That proposition is eternally true if it corresponds to reality. He knows all such specific, dated facts.
They try to replace the indexicals now, today, with fixed dates and times.
Exactly. Translate, I am typing now into Gansel, types at specific date and time.
What?
God timelessly knows that eternally true or false proposition. His knowledge doesn't need to change as our now moves along the timeline.
Okay, but the pushback is, does knowing all those dated facts equal knowing what is happening right now? There seems to be a difference between knowing an event happens at time t and knowing an event is happening now.
That's the crucial objection, and this is where the philosophy of time really bites the A theory versus B theory debate.
Remind us quickly.
B theory sees time just as relations, earlier than, later than, simultaneous with, like positions on a map. There's no objective privilege now. A theory says, no, the now, the present moment, is objectively real. Time genuinely flows or passes. Past, present, and future are real features of reality, not just perspectives.
And reducing everything to dated facts works better if the B theory is true.
Yes. If there's no objective now, then knowing all the dated facts is knowing everything there is to know about time. But if the A theory is true, if now is a real feature of the world, then it seems an omniscient God must know what is now.
And if God knows the objective now, and that now changes, it pulls God into time.
That's the argument used by many temporalists. They argue for the A theory to support divine temporality. Timelessness defenders then either have to embrace the B theory or argue that timelessness is compatible with the A theory somehow.
Are there other responses from the timeless camp about knowing now?
Yes, some distinguish between factual omniscience and propositional omniscience regarding indexicals. Maybe God knows all the facts about what's happening now, but doesn't need to know them via propositions containing now. His awareness is direct.
So God knows the reality of my speaking now without forming the thought he's speaking now.
Perhaps. Or maybe some facts are just essentially indexical. You can't fully capture them without now or here. That's debated too. Another angle from William Alston suggests God's knowledge isn't propositional belief at all, but direct awareness of reality. Maybe that allows awareness of now without internal change.
Wow. So many layers to this knowledge argument. It really depends on your underlying view of time and knowledge itself.
Absolutely. Now, you also asked about those in-between views.
Yeah. The ones trying to bridge the gap, what are they like?
Well, one idea from folks like Paget and Dewey's is that God is relatively atemporal or maybe omnitemporal.
Meaning?
They suggest God isn't in physical time, the time of clocks, physics, entropy, but he is eternally temporal in a more fundamental metaphysical time.
So God experiences a now, a succession, but it's not tied to our universe's specific timeline or laws.
Kind of. It's an attempt to have it both ways. God is transcendent over physical time, satisfying timelessness intuitions, but also experiences a present and acts sequentially, satisfying temporality intuitions.
That's the catch.
The challenge is defining this metaphysical time. If it doesn't have metric intervals or follow laws, how different is it really from timelessness, especially some versions of a temporal duration? The lines can get blurry.
Okay. And William Lane Craig has a different take again.
He does. Craig identifies God's time more with something like Newton's absolute time, or maybe a privileged frame in a specific interpretation of relativity. But his most distinctive view is that God was timeless without creation and became temporal with creation.
God changed from timeless to temporal.
That's his view. Before creation isn't a time before time, but a state of timelessness. Then, with creation, God enters into time along with the universe he made.
That raises fascinating questions. Like, if timeless God knew the B-theory fact, Gansel types, on December gone 2006, how does the now temporal God know the A-theory fact, Gansel types now?
Craig's answer involves saying that before creation, temporal indexical propositions like Gansel types now were simply false because now didn't exist yet. Only with creation does now become meaningful, and God, now temporal, knows it.
But doesn't that seem to prioritize the B-theory? Dated facts as somehow true even timelessly, while the A theory now only pops into existence later.
That's a potential criticism, yes. It seems to privilege one kind of temporal fact over the other, and it raises the Hughes metaphysical question. Can a being transition from timelessness to temporality?
Would Stump and Cressman agree with Craig on that?
Likely not. Their view emphasizes God's immutability, his unchanging nature. A shift from timeless to temporal seems like a fundamental change they'd probably reject. Dewey's likely also disagrees.
This is just incredibly rich and complex. It really hits fundamental questions about reality, God, time itself.
It really does. And as we've seen, these aren't settled questions. Philosophers and theologians are still actively debating all these points, refining the arguments, exploring the implications.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear there's no single easy answer to God and time.
Definitely not. Whether God is timeless, temporal, or something in between, it affects how we understand everything from prayer to free will to creation itself.
Okay, so here's a final thought for everyone listening. Reflect on your own gut feeling about time. Is it a flowing river, A theory feel, or more like a static map, B theory feel? How might that underlying intuition shape how you lean on this question of God's relationship to time?
And maybe ponder that distinction. Is there a fundamental difference between knowing about a moment, knowing all the facts tied to a specific date and time, and actually experiencing that moment as now? Perhaps exploring the A and B theories of time further is the next step for anyone intrigued by this whole discussion.
A great place to leave it. Thanks for navigating this complex territory with us.
My pleasure. It's fascinating stuff.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.